guess. Mario, do you want to start? So, page 8 of the definition sheet, Democritus.
All reality is made out of atoms, uncuttable, in different arrangements, randomly falling into different things. The soul is made of circular fire atoms. 188. Materialist, reified pluralism.
Okay, so obviously it's materialism, and then it's pluralism, right? There's what is everything made of? What's the first principle? Well, there's atoms, and there's many of them, so it's pluralism, and they're actual things, right? They're not like it's not like just a process, or it's not qualities. Basically, that's what Wheelwright says, that when you talk about the four elements, it's more like it's qualitative. He calls it qualitative chemistry. It's mainly focused on things being hot or cold and so on. Whereas here, there's actual little solids that are uncuttable. James, you want to read Protagoras?
Protagoras, sophist, relativist, agnostic, rhetorician. Man is the measure of all things. First, secular humanist, anthropocentrism.
Okay, so I think that's, I mean, what I'm calling him, right, the first secular humanist, right? Secularist in the sense of religion is not something you take seriously. And then humanist, right, that man is the measure of all things. I mean, so certainly that's relativism, right, that everything is just relative to each individual. And then he would want to put a positive spin on that to say that, well, you know, that means that each of us gets to have our own truth, you know. And so you could see it's centered on humans, anthropocentrism, and it's secular humanism, right? That's I think, is a fair characterization. Let's look at page 236. So this is actually pretty much it for the Wheelwright book, is the Sophist. And then hopefully we'll make it to Plato today. So he's talking about the word sophist here. The bottom paragraph on 236 says Protagoras of Abdera. Matthew?
Protagoras of Abdera.
Don't worry about that.
Okay. Was the acknowledged initiator of the sophistic movement. The word sophistes is composed by adding to the word for wisdom a suffix connoting a man who practices a profession and who is thus in some way an expert. A sophist, therefore, means something like a wisdom expert. There is a paradoxical shock in both the Greek and the English versions of the idea. For while there can perhaps be experts in any finite field of activity or inquiry, which is to say persons with the know-how to achieve specific results, it is as meaningless to speak of an expert in wisdom as to speak of an expert in goodness. Nevertheless, Protagoras and his followers did in fact make the claim.
Okay, so that's an excellent little paragraph there, right? That it means, because remember, Sophia is wisdom, Sophos is wise, and then Sophistes is, that's a good way of putting it. It's like a wisdom expert. That's what they presented themselves as. And as he says, that like, how can you be an expert in that, right? But that's what they were saying. So especially because they focused on rhetoric and convincing people. Okay, 239, brother, fragment 1.
Man is the measure of all things, of things that they are, and of things that are not, that they are not.
So there was a bit of that in Heraclitus, right? A bit of relativism, but it wasn't thorough. It wasn't universal. Whereas this is just a universal, unqualified statement of relativism, right? There's no limits to it, and he's basically as consistent with that as he can manage, as are the other sophists. And of course, Socrates is the combatant of the sophists, or he's the one who's opposing them, and that's right how he ended up being executed, because the sophists were very critical of him. Okay. Yeah.
All matter is in the state of flux, and fluctuating theme may retain its shape, however, because the changes may be such that the additions compensate for the losses. It is our sense impressions of the theme that get modified, because affected by age and other bodily conditions.
So who does that remind you of?
Heraclitus.
Aging and age.
What's that?
Makes you think of like people aging and everything, like people changing.
Okay, true. Yeah, people change. But when he just says all matter is in a state of flux,
Oh, no, I'm not sure what to make.
not sure. That's okay.
Sounds like Heraclitus.
Right. So that was what Heraclitus was saying. Right. It's process, change.
Also, like the atomists, because they said that the atoms are always moving.
Yeah. Right. I mean,
In a
they were
way,
also
yeah.
influenced by Heraclitus. He's contemporary though with them, so it wouldn't really necessarily. It's from Heraclitus. He's even a little bit earlier than Democritus, although they overlap. Let's see, page. Fragment number 6. Griffin.
As for the gods, I have no way of knowing either that they exist or that they do not exist, nor if they exist or what form they are. For the obstacle to that sort of knowledge are many, including the obscurity of the matter and the brevity of human life.
Okay, so this is what is this called? Anybody?
Agnosticism.
Right? So he's not being an atheist saying that gods do not exist, nothing divine exists. He's saying, well, I just don't know, right? This is agnosticism. I don't know if they exist or not, or if they do exist, of what form they are. So in a sense, it's also just in the context, right? It's a way to be a skeptic about religion without getting in trouble. Because remember, as we said, right, it's a political and religion, politics and religion kind of go together, right? It's a state religion that if you're an Athenian citizen, you're supposed to participate in it. So he could still participate in like all the festivals they have, and just like, well, I don't know if they exist or not, as opposed to coming out and saying they don't exist. The obstacles are many, including the obscurity of the matter and the brevity of human life. So that even if you had your whole life, that wouldn't be enough time to figure out whether gods exist or not. So let's just be agnostics. Interesting contrast to Xenophanes. Remember, Xenophanes was like 92 or something, and he said, oh, after so many years wandering Greece, and then he had reached the conclusion that there can't be many gods fighting with each other. There must be one God. Okay, let's go to testimony 3. Oh, yeah.
Oh,
question?
actually, no. I was gonna ask about testimony 3, so.
Yeah, let's go to testimony 3. Very good. Who's next? So this is from the Theaetetus. So now remember, when I said they opposed Socrates, they're very urbane and polite about it, right? they're not. I don't know what to. In a sense, it's very different from like it's not like sometimes public discourse nowadays can get very I don't know, irrational. This is not like that. They're putting their arguments very clearly. Kind of, this is what the Platonic dialogues contain, right? Is them stating their arguments in a very rational way. Because remember, mythos versus logos, right? They're trying to use reason, and they're using reason to argue their points. So, and then this is why this is the beginnings of philosophy, right? And he's going to argue his point extremely well. There's also a whole dialogue called the Protagoras. Gorgias is another major sophist. There's a whole dialogue, meaning 40 or 50 pages, called the Gorgias. Now it's written by Plato, but people back then could take notes, and so I think what happened was Plato took notes. I mean, he may have modified a little bit. Maybe he shortened it down a little bit if it was a 2 or 3 hour conversation. He took the main points, but I think these are substantively right records of conversations, or they're records of conversations. Maybe also just putting the best argument in the best way you can. Maybe condensing a little bit or taking things from writings, that kind of thing. But that's what's very impressive about Plato is he does allow the sophists to argue in their own terms as best they can, and they make it sound extremely convincing. So that's one thing that characterizes philosophy as opposed to rhetoric. In rhetoric, oftentimes you want to take the weakest version of your opponent's argument, or you want to caricature their argument, right? That's what I was saying. That's a lot of what tends to dominate public discourse is rhetoric, and really also in a bad sense of the term, but also called heuristics. Whereas here, he's letting them give their argument and trying to you're trying to use reason to adjudicate, right, which is true or false. So on the topic of relativism, if you wanted to read about that, the Gorgias would be excellent, because now the thing about the dialogues is there's other topics in them, so they're not like Aristotle. Aristotle was really the first one to just write a sustained treatise on one topic. He was the first one to divide philosophy into parts. So he has his politics on political philosophy, his ethics, his logic, right? He has different works on each topic. It hadn't really reached that point yet with Plato. So Plato, his dialogues can cover 1, 2, 3, half a dozen topics. But at least, a large portion of the Gorgias is about this debate about relativism, likewise for the Pythagoras. So you can see it's also very timely, because relativism is very much a feature of the modern world, the modern mindset, that each person can decide their own truth. That's not uncommon. Okay, who's next to read?
Pythagoras is represented as speaking. Of course, I don't deny that there is such a thing as wisdom, and that wise men exist. But what I mean by a wise man is one who can alter people's ways of judging, so that what appears and is to them bad now will appear and will be to them good.
I mean, so, see, I don't doubt that's Pythagoras' own words, because it's a very convincing way to describe it. On a certain level, it's true, right? Like, if I think that something is bad, it's bad for me, in a sense. Like, if I don't, so he's going to compare it to, like, food, right? It's true that maybe, like, drinking milk is bad for you, right? If you're lactose intolerant, and it's not bad for me, correct? So it's a very clever example to give, because that's actually true, right? Even though you think milk is good, so you could say the same thing for that. He's applying that to morality, like, if you think that if you think keeping the Ten Commandments is good, that's good for you. But I don't think so, right, to each his own. You can see how it's very tied in with, of course, political philosophy very quickly, right, both ethics and political philosophy. But even before that, there's just a basic kind of metaphysical question of, is there an actual reality that we can agree on? Because for him, no matter what it is, each one has his own truth. So it's like the case of food, which appears and is bitter to a sick man, but appears and is the opposite to a healthy one. So, right, appearance and being, right, that he's saying that they're basically the same. And then he defines education as changing people from a worse to a better condition. Whereas the physician brings that about by drugs, the sophist does so by means of words. And what he's going to say is the better condition is you thinking what Pythagoras thinks it's best for you to think. So there's also an elitism there, right? This idea that there's an elite who knows what's best and what's better. That's also these are just features of the modern world. So the medieval world was more based on like realism. There weren't really many skeptics. It's not true to say there were none, but you would never have heard of them. They didn't really have any influence. But with the modern turn to the subject, cogito ergo sum, then skepticism and relativism, there was basically a resurgence of those things. We'll come back to that, but let's read a bit more. The point is, Jake, voluntary.
It is like with the bottom here.
Yeah.
Bottom paragraph. The point is not that a man who thinks what is false is taught to think what is true. It is not possible to think what is false, because one can only think what he experiences, and what he experiences is true.
Right. So I mean, this isn't just relativism. He's actually arguing for it much more convincingly than any modern or contemporary proponent of relativism ever had. They basically just typically, because like this is very common in certain forms of ethics and political thinking, right? And they basically will just assert it and say, well, everyone has the right to decide what reality is, and so on and so forth. I mean, the Supreme Court put that into the Casey decision that supported Roe v. Wade. They said everyone has the right to decide what reality is, what life is. So therefore, with abortion, right, if for you that's an unborn child, then good for you. But if for someone else it's not, then it's not. So, right? But he's actually giving some pretty clever argumentation. So it's not that you're taking someone from false to what's true, right? Remember, philosophy is supposed to be a search for truth. For him, anything that anyone thinks is true, right? As long as you think it by the very fact that you think it. It's not possible to think what's false. How could he's saying, right? You only think what you experience. Then he gives an argument for that. You only think what you experience, and what you experience is true. So this is true in certain cases, right? Like I said, if I eat an orange and then I eat a piece of chocolate, the chocolate tastes bitter. So see, there are certain cases where, in that case, due to the modification of the organ, for want of a better term, scientists could give you a better explanation. But you get the idea, right? As saying that my tongue has been somewhat modified by having something really sweet on it, so now the chocolate tastes bitter, right? But it doesn't taste bitter to you if you haven't, see? So it's, or like I talked about the blinding light when I come out of the movie theater, right? But the point is, the exception doesn't prove the rule. You follow, right? Does that mean that, I don't know, nothing has any taste unless what you want to say it has? No, right? The exception doesn't prove the rule, right? Does the fact that I'm blinded when I come out of the sun, it doesn't mean that the sun isn't bright and that the movie theater isn't dark. Not everything is always relative in every way, which is what he is quite explicitly saying. Okay.
Consider, however, the case of a man who has gotten to a bad, i.e. unhealthy condition of soul, and whose thoughts reflect that condition. If he can be brought to a good, i.e. healthy, condition of soul, his thoughts will be correspondingly better. The resulting appearances are sometimes ignorantly spoken of as true. I, however, do not call them truer than the earlier ones, but simply better. Consequently, my dear Socrates, instead of comparing us sophists to jumping frogs, as you did, you might better have recognized us to be a kind of physician.
So he compared them to jumping frogs because every time he tried to pin them down in the argument, they would always switch to a different topic. You may experience that sometime if you debate with people. It can be really hard to pin people down. As soon as you go from one point and they're starting to make progress, they just switch to a different topic, and that could keep happening. So he compared them to jumping frogs. And so he says, no, we're a physician. We're helping people have better, healthier thoughts. Right? Because education, as he said, is to change people from a better to a worse to a better condition. Next.
Farmers, in curing sickly plants, simply try to replace unhealthy modes of assimilation by healthy modes. No question of truth or falsity in such cases. In like manner, responsible breeders seek to improve their city-state, polis, by instilling in its citizens workable notions of what is right in place of unhealthy ones.
Okay. So notice when he says that whatever you experience is true, and then it said the appearances are sometimes spoken of as true. What he means there, he just said that if you think it is true, right? What he means is absolute truth. He's saying there's not an absolute truth, right? So if you say that something is absolutely true, you're wrong. But if you say something is 100% relatively true to what you're thinking at this moment, because it can change from moment to moment, right? So that's how clear he is and radical he is about his relativism. It doesn't have to stay the same over time. And actually, he wants to help people change the way they think. And as he explained, that's what people pay him to do. He's a rhetorician, right? He's teaching people to be speakers. He's teaching people to change how they think. And that's how he makes his living. And as for what they should think, that's up to his client, whoever is hiring him. So they were all... Remember, public speaking back then also overlapped between politics and law, which I guess is still true nowadays, right? There's a fair amount of lawyers or judges who go into politics. It makes sense, right? So that's how it was in ancient Athens. Public speaking was something both in the democracy that it was, right, to convince people to vote a certain way, because it was an absolute democracy, right? It wasn't a republic like we have. And then also in a legal setting, like if someone's being accused of a crime, you have to, be able to use speech to convince the whatever judge and jury that they're innocent. And and according to what he says, if the person feels like they're innocent, then they're innocent. Like there's nothing, right? The facts don't matter, right? What matters is how the person feels and thinks at that time. And we're going to see the other sophists say that as well. Okay, my position.
My position then is that whatever seems right and admirable to a particular city-state is truly right and admirable during the period of time in which that opinion continues to be held.
Right, so it can change at any moment, right? At any moment for any reason, and that's kind of the rhetorician's job, is to help them know that this is how you should think at this point in time. And so that's what there is, a definite elitism here, right? Of him getting paid. They even mentioned like how much he was paid. He's paid like a lot of money in whatever denariuses or whatever it was, denari talents, or, right? He was not a poor person. And notice here he establishes, so it certainly applies to individuals, but also a kind of social relativism, right? Where whatever the majority thinks is good. If they all vote for it, then that is good. There's nothing independent of that. So I don't know how familiar you guys are with arguing against relativism, but it's very common. So the kind of thing I would argue would be, well, was slavery good, right? Even though, because right, slavery, the simple fact is, the problem with slavery is, with fallen human nature, you can't really give fallen human beings that much authority over other human beings without any kind of constraint, right? Now in the Old Testament, by the way, remember there were constraints on these things too. I mean, it wasn't necessarily absolute, but to just give someone absolute power over someone else, given fallen human nature, I mean, now of course if we weren't fallen, why would you want to do that first? But the point is that, right, people say, oh, well, everything is relative. So, okay, so if they voted that slavery is good, or any other, right, moral evil. Okay, go ahead.
And that it is the wise man's task, when the people are afflicted with unsound beliefs, to substitute others so that they seem true and therefore are true. Thus the sophist who trains his pupils on the same principle thereby shows his wisdom and justifies his claim to a large fee when the course of training is over. It is in this sense, and in this sense only, that some men are wiser than others, which does not affect the truth of the proposition that there is no such thing as thinking falsely.
Right, so that's when he talks about, when he says, when he criticizes truth, he says you can't speak of things as true, he means absolutely speaking. But relatively speaking, yes, there is truth for each one of us, just because we're thinking it.
So it seems like at the heart of sophistry is like this belief in like radical pragmatism.
Yep, that exactly. So this, I mean, I could have added on the definition sheet. There also, you can see pragmatists, exactly. I just don't want to put everything on there, but right. Okay, so that's what he did. So let's look at Aristotle's critique for a minute here. Nancy, 24.
There's a doctrine of Protagoras in which he said that man is the measure of all things. He was saying, in other words, that each individual's private impression is absolutely true. But if that position is adopted, then it follows that the same thing is and is not, that it is both good and bad, and similarly for other contradictions. Because after all, a given thing will seem beautiful to one group of people and ugly to another. And by the theory in question of each conflicting appearances will be the measure.
Right, T6.
If it is equally possible to affirm and to deny anything whatever on any subject, then a given thing will be at once a ship, a wall, and a man, which is the necessary conclusion for those who hold the theory of Protagoras.
Right, so you're allowed to say whatever, if you want to think that, and if you want to say it, then that's what it is for you. Right, I've said that before. I said if I decide the computer's a camel or something like that. Christian, T8.
They were right who rejected the kind of training that Protagoras offered, for this art was a deceptive one, in that it could not establish real probabilities, but merely specious plausibilities.
Okay, so that's from Aristotle's Rhetoric. About, right, it's, yeah, you can see the criticism. Let's see, T10. Why don't we look at the definition sheet before we do that? So we already read on page 8, so let's read page 9. Timothy, agnostic.
Agnostic. One cannot know whether God or the gods exist. The divine is irrelevant for all practical and speculative purposes. For example, Pythagoras, two kinds. A, strong. One cannot prove or disprove the existence of the supernatural.
Right, so he was saying you can't even know if the gods exist, which is a stronger statement. The other thing, which is kind of more common, is to say, well, there's probably something out there. There's got to be something out there, but I don't know what it is. Okay?
B, weak. One cannot prove or disprove the nature of the supernatural compared to indifferentism.
So indifferentism is the idea that all religions are equal. It makes no difference. It's indifferent what religion you are because we don't really know what God is anyway, right? Would be the case here. So just whatever makes you feel good. Okay.
Most hold both or varieties of each at different times. For example, Carl Jung.
So remember, I did praise Carl Jung's and used his idea of archetypes for the Greek deities. That's a very helpful idea that he introduced. But he himself was a committed agnostic, although he really wavered. Sometimes he says he's not sure if anything supernatural exists, but then other times he says there's definitely something supernatural, we just don't really know what it is. Okay.
Atheist denies the existence of God and or the gods. A, dogmatic, strong. God certainly does not exist. For example, Diodorus of Melos, the 5th BC, and Nietzsche.
So Diagoras, it's funny he's not included, but there's no fragments from him. So I guess there's just not enough material. But eventually I would think he merits being included. Because notice, he's the only one who comes out clearly as an atheist. No one we've seen has actually been 100% clear an atheist. Because remember, even Democritus talked about these images, talking images. And you could say, well, he means they're hallucinating, but he doesn't actually say that. He's purposely being careful. So Diagoras of Melos, he's one of the only 2 or 3 people whose names are recorded who was an actual atheist. So they did have that word atheist, and they used it for him. They used it for anyone who denied the Greek gods, whether it was Socrates, who was actually monotheist, or whether it was Diagoras. And he was exiled, which in the ancient world, if you read like the classics, Latin and Greek texts, that was viewed as kind of a fate worse than death for them. It's kind of amazing how upset they got. Like they would, if they were condemned to exile, sometimes they would just kill themselves, I think. Like Ovid, they would. So anyway, Diagoras was condemned to exile for being an atheist. So that's what I was saying before about how they're not necessarily going to come out and say what they really think for that reason. But one of the stories about him is, just to show you how like atheism has the same spirit even 2,500 years ago, right? When he saw the offerings to Poseidon from people who had been saved, right? They were on the boat, it looked like it was going to go down. They prayed to Poseidon, they survived, when they came back, they offered to Poseidon. And he said, where are the offerings from the people who drowned? Okay, meaning, he's very cynical and sarcastic. I mean, it is, I think it is funny, I do laugh, but of course I laugh also because I don't take that seriously, right? Providence doesn't mean that God is not at our beck and call like that, right? If we pray to him, he's necessarily going to do whatever we ask him. We're not the one telling him what to do. So we're asking him, right? And we hope that he'll answer, and we can be grateful if he does, and if he doesn't, then his greater wisdom, right, has deemed something different. But that was his sarcasm, right? And then, of course, Nietzsche, right, in the modern, really more the contemporary period, since the 1800s, is when you have lots of atheists, right? It becomes the norm. Okay.
Non-dogmatic is weak. Arguments for God and all the gods are most likely flawed. For example, Sartre, Hume is inconsistent, either this or deism or irreligion.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to call Hume a strong atheist because he doesn't really seem to care that much. So yeah, probably God doesn't exist, or if he does exist, he doesn't have anything to do with the world, which is deism. Or if he does exist and he has anything to do with the world, religion makes no difference. So he's kind of always changing what he's saying, which is, once again, even in the 1700s when he was writing, you could get in trouble. Remember, this is Anglicanism. So the idea of that teaching atheism was a politically punished. That wasn't just a Catholic thing. That was just how things were in the I don't know, back then. Even in the 1700s, you could get in trouble for openly teaching atheism. You could end up being exiled or something, right? Both in America and so that's how the world used to be. So anyway, that would explain why he's inconsistent, right? One minute he's an atheist, next, but then you read 10 pages later, now he's saying, well, maybe deism, and he keeps changing his mind. Or keeps changing what he's saying. Okay, Matthew, skepticism, number 1.
Skepticism, certain knowledge is unattainable because both sensation and reason are unreliable.
So, Xeniades, once again, someone you never would have heard of, but he's the first skeptic. We don't have any fragments from him, but he is the first person with that, who apparently taught that. Okay?
Relativism. There is no objective truth or falsehood, or good or evil, only personal opinions or societal views. For example, Protagoras. Each statement is true for the one asserting it at that moment. Each is always right, no matter what each one says. Aristotle's critique. This means that contradiction is impossible. Speech becomes meaningless.
Okay, so we'll come back to that in the metaphysics class. Book 4 of the metaphysics, book Gamma, is where he criticizes skepticism and relativism. So we will come back to that later. But in a nutshell, the way he criticizes them is by the principle of non-contradiction. Gerald?
Principle of non-contradiction. Something cannot both be and not be at the same time, and in the same breath. Logical prerequisite of all knowledge.
Okay. So you can see, right, as opposed to relativism where everything is whatever you want it to be, here it can't be two things at the same time in the same respect. So, right, the board can't be white and black at the same time in the same respect. That's impossible. Which of course presupposes sensory realism, that you can trust your senses. Okay, so page 248, we have Gorgias here. Let's read number 2. This is a good example of like rhetoric, Derek, on page 248, fragment 2.
In contending against adversaries, destroy their seriousness with laughter, and their laughter with seriousness.
Okay, so you can see the use of rhetoric there, right? In order to win an argument in a political realm or in a legal realm, right? I'm sure if any of you guys have been lawyers or something or worked in that area, you may be familiar. Fragment 9.
When persuasion joins with speech, it can affect the soul in any way it wishes.
Okay, so, right, he says it's not because of the truth of what you're saying, but the power of speech. So similar to Protagoras. How about testimony 2, Brian, on page 252, the bottom? This is a good one.
Protarchus. When I was attending Gorgias's lectures, I heard him repeatedly declare that the art of persuasion was superior to all other arts, because it gained power over its objects not by force, but by their willing submission.
Okay, similar to what we saw in Protagoras, right? Helping them to think the correct way. Okay, 259. Why don't you keep reading, Ryan? Thrasymachus of Chalcedon, number 1 and 2. You both.
Justice is simply the advantage of the stronger.
Okay, so that's from the Republic of Plato. So, kind of segueing into Plato now, right? So Plato's Republic is his magnum opus, his major work. And it starts off with it's 12 books, but book 1 is centers around a debate between Socrates and Thrasymachus. And Thrasymachus, that's what he's defending, is that justice is just the advantage of the stronger. There is no kind of objective justice. It's just whatever the stronger people want to do. They make laws that make it just. Okay? So, and it's really what he's calling justice is what we would call injustice, right? It means imposing your will on others and then calling it good and just, even no matter what it is. So, right? And there's a very, kind of brilliant debate about that back and forth in the Book 1 of the Republic. And then Book 1 of the Republic does do a good job of refuting Thrasymachus, of course, from the perspective of virtue ethics, and right, not from a relativist perspective. And then the other 11 books, like I said, they contain all ethics, politics, metaphysics, all these different kinds of topics. Okay, number 2.
The gods evidently do not see human affairs. If they did, they would not neglect to bestow justice on mankind. For it is the greatest of blessings, yet men make little use of it.
Okay. Remember his definition of justice, though. So that's deism, right? That the gods don't know and they don't care and they don't intervene. Okay. Antiphon is also is another sophist, but okay. So that's basically just briefly done with them. All right. Yep.
So was sophistry kind of the largest school, or is it just like?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, well, right. I mean, so they were rhetoricians. There's a sense in which they're not philosophers, right? Because their whole point is that there is no truth. There's just pragmatism, what they call expedience, right? Do what's expedient. Antiphon talks about that, right? You should just do what's expedient. There's no such thing as absolute good or evil. So, you know, what he says is just do what's not going to get you in trouble. Kind of idea of like it's not wrong if nobody catches you, that kind of thing. So they weren't really a school of philosophy. They're more like anti-philosophy because they're saying there is no truth. All these different philosophers have all these different views on what truth is, and then what they're saying is that's a waste of time. Basically, it doesn't matter. What matters is pragmatic things, and but yeah, there's easily about half a dozen or a dozen major ones. I mean, more than you have here. And they were the ones, as you can see, like a number of Socratic dialogues are named after them. The Pythagoras, the Gorgias. There's a debate between Socrates and Antiphon in Xenophon's Memoirs of Socrates. So they're consistently kind of antagonists, is what I was looking for. They're Socrates' antagonists, arguing for relativism, pragmatism, and so on, the value of rhetoric. Being able to convince people by very clever arguments and moving their emotions, and then Socrates is the opposite. So like in the Apology, Socrates' Apology is right at his trial. There's 3 groups that are basically have gotten him in trouble. One is the sophists, the other is the poets, including Aristophanes, who wrote a comedy called The Clouds. That's making fun of Socrates, saying he just has his head in the clouds and he's completely cut off from reality, from ordinary life. We still use that metaphor, right? And then the craftsmen also, because Socrates keeps saying that like money and worldly success don't matter, and so they kind of had a bone to pick with Socrates because their sons, who they want to be successful, wealthy craftsmen like themselves, this guy named Socrates keeps telling them that doesn't matter, and they're like, well, it's almost like St. Francis' dad. His dad was upset because he wanted his son to be a successful, wealthy merchant, not some kind of loser, basically. So, as we would say nowadays. So, who doesn't, you understand. So, in the Apology, he says those are the 3 groups criticizing him. The poets, meaning like Aristophanes, then of course the sophists are the major group, and they're the ones debating, and in the Apology he has a debate again. He says like, well, how is it wrong to teach virtue? And they're like, there's no such thing. What you say is virtue. It's up to each person. There's no such thing as virtue. There's just what's virtuous for you, for each one of us, at this moment in time. Like how I feel at 10:01 on Monday morning. That's what's virtuous for me right now. So see, I mean, they're more like anti-philosophy. And in that sense, what's interesting is like in the 20th century, a lot of the postmoderns, you kind of end up back with sophistry. So you kind of end up back in 5th century Athens with people like Michel Foucault, where he is very emphatic that there is no such thing as truth. Like even what he's saying to you, he's very emphatic. He's not saying to you because it's true. He's just saying to you because it's useful, it's pragmatic. He says, right, there's no such thing as nature. There's no such thing even as concepts. It's very nihilistic. But also pragmatism, and that's where postmodern philosophy has a lot in common with the sophist. So anyway, yeah. Okay.
And then is pragmatism, is that what you said, like, is what is useful? Is that kind of
Right, exactly. Just being pragmatic is what's pragmatic is what matters. Like, who cares? All this, the whole previous book, who cares? Like, well, the medicine, I guess you can care about that because it makes it'll help you not to be sick. We didn't read about Hippocrates, but all right. But water, earth, air, waste of time. Just right. You have needs in ordinary life, and that's what matters. And, right? Does the God exist? I don't know. I don't care either. Like.
I was reading some of the Palmer book about the sophists, and it kind of it depicts Cytrius of Athens as very much kind of a hedonist, someone who believes in seeking pleasure. I was just kind of a little confused because there's only 7 fragments of his, and it doesn't.
Which page?
260.
Oh, Critias?
Yeah.
Yep. And so the thing is, they will speak about moderation, right? That's part of the Greek culture. But remember, Epicurus talks about moderation. It's common sense. Like, if you drink too much, you can stumble down the stairs and break your leg. And then are you going to be happy? No. Is it pragmatic to get drunk? No. Right? Is it pragmatic to kill your enemies in broad daylight? No. Is it pragmatic to, see what I mean? So you have to remember, when they talk about virtue and moderation, it's not coming from a place of virtue ethics of like that you have a soul that's immortal that you want to have a happy afterlife. It's coming from a place of pragmatism, right? You could be a pragmatist and still not get drunk and still not do drugs and still not, I don't know, steal at least in a way that you're going to get caught and still not lie in a way that's going to make people hate you. You see what I mean? But it's where it's coming from. Because they will talk about things like moderation and balance, and they'll talk about obeying the laws, like Antiphon, but he'll say, well, what's just is to obey the laws. So if the law says I can have slaves, I can, right? I'm just. And if the law says okay for me to treat them however I want, I treat them however I want because it's not against the law, right? That's called legal positivism. I don't know if you remember that term. Legal positivism is whatever the law says, that is good or evil. And if it changes, then good and evil just change because there's nothing more or beyond that. So it ties in, like it said, Protagoras studied under Democritus. So in that sense, it ties in with that. Remember Democritus saying, you shouldn't just have babies, you should adopt because you should get to pick, you want to avoid stress, you want to avoid headaches. But they could still talk about being moderate and, just in the sense of legal positivism. Is that?
Well, I was also going to ask, I was kind of wondering where does the hedonism maybe come from, like testimonies that Wheelwright doesn't?
Yeah, there must be other ones if he's saying that, yeah.
Okay.
Because these are not all the testimonies or all the fragments, yeah. So. Okay, well, Hippocrates, you may have heard of him, the Hippocratic Oath, but we won't do that this time. All right, so let's go on to Plato. So we already actually kind of started talking about him. So with Plato, as I mentioned, right, so these are all pre-Socratic because they're before Socrates. In those dialogues that we're reading excerpts from, Socrates is always the one who speaks. So Plato, there's basically 3 periods of Platonic dialogues. There's the early dialogues, which are called Socratic, which is pretty much probably his notes from Socrates debating, as I've explained with Protagoras. There's middle dialogues. So we're done with the pre-Socratic book, right? There's middle dialogues of Plato, like the Republic, which is largely his own ideas. And there's late dialogues, which is just pure Plato. There's no Socrates left anymore. But Plato never speaks in any of the dialogues. I think it was his way of practicing humility, I suppose, because you could see that Protagoras, the people like Protagoras were very happy to be famous and well known. That was actually what they wanted to do, was to be, because that's part of how you convince people of their public image, as we would now say. And Plato, I guess, going against that, didn't really want to have a public image, so he never appears. He's mentioned once at the Phaedo is the dialogue about Socrates' death, and it just mentions Plato wasn't there. So he mentions his name once. That's it. In all, 600 pages. So he always speaks through Socrates, even the late dialogues, okay? So he certainly is similar to Socrates in the virtue, right, his ethics, virtue ethics, the philosophical monotheism, which is in the green Plotinus book, the appendix. So we'll actually come back to him when we do Plotinus, because he includes in that appendix about 30, 40 pages from Plato. And it's very helpful because he gives you some of the text where he talks about God, like God making, that he created the gods, which is extremely important, right? That he's not on a par with the gods, that he made them. That lets you know this is monotheism, not some kind of henotheism where they're co-eternal, something like that. So we'll come back to that later. But as far as his ethics, it's very much like Socrates. And then what we're interested in here more is his metaphysics and epistemology. So his metaphysics revolves around the forms. And so we have some handouts, we have some readings that are going to kind of center on that. So there's a reading from the Republic, and there's a reading from the Symposium. And why don't we just look at the definition sheet, though, to get started here. So the forms, what he's trying to do with that is, so he's a dualist regarding human nature, which means that the physical world is an illusion, right? And what's real is the soul. So the opposite of materialism, right? The materialists are saying, well, everything that exists is material, your soul's not a fire or whatever. And he's saying, no, the whole physical world is an illusion. It's not truly real. And that what's truly real is your soul. Now remember, this is like Parmenides. This is why we spent a fair amount of time on Parmenides. Because you can see, out of all the pre-Socratics, who is he agreeing with the most? Basically Parmenides, right? That the physical world is a realm of non-being. The true being is your soul. So the difference is where Parmenides, it wasn't quite clear what to make of my soul, like, because it was this absolute monism of just everything being one. Plato does not say that. He says that each of us has a soul, and that the soul is being united to the body, even though the body doesn't really exist, as a punishment. Because remember, existence for him means spiritual being. It means transcending matter. So the soul is united to the body as a punishment, and our goal is there's a cycle of reincarnation, and our goal is to kind of break free of the cycle of reincarnation and make it back to where we fell from. Okay? So the forms then are these, well, let's just read it. Who's next?
Form. Eternal, unchanging, spiritual exemplar or essence of which physical things are copies. For example, the horse itself, also called idea, confuses mental and real orders by attributing what is true of one's concept to a real thing.
Okay, so in terms of his epistemology or study of knowledge, right? I see, this horse, that horse, another horse. Eventually I form a concept of horse. So the question is, where does that concept come from? So when it comes to the spiritual world, he agrees with, or his overall world, he agrees with Parmenides. But when it comes to the physical world, he agrees with Heraclitus, that the physical world is always changing. That's why it's not the realm of being, right? And so therefore it's, I can't really know it. So because those horses are always changing and they're different, how can I have a stable concept of horse based on horses that come and go, they get sick, they get old, right? And so instead of saying that there's a nature of horse that I know, which is what Aristotle has been saying, he says there's an immaterial form of horse in the spiritual realm, which is the true being of the horse, because right, the immaterial realm and being, that's what goes together. The physical and non-being go together. Remember from Parmenides, right? It's part of where we go through Plato a little bit quickly, because having studied Parmenides, you can already see the basic dichotomy, right? The basic structure of things. So in order for me to have a concept of horse, I have to know something that's not changing, that's eternal, and that's not material but immaterial. So it's the exemplar of which all physical things are copies. And the way that things, quote unquote, exist in the physical world is by participation in the forms. Next one.
Participation. Physical, individual things are what they are, by somehow sharing in the forms.
Okay, so there's a form of horse in itself, right? That's you would, when you're talking about the forms, you should always give it a capital F to show this is a unique form, there's only one of them. The form of the horse, or you could call it an idea, form/idea with a capital I, right? So in the heaven of forms, there's this form of horse, right, that's eternal, that's unchanging. That's the spiritual realm that we fell from, and we were angels, let's say, right, before we were punished by being put into a body. And so then every horse that exists in the world is a participation in that one horse, whether they're big or little or so on and so forth, okay? So this is how he basically tries to explain both epistemology, both how we get our concepts. So my concept of horse comes from remembering back when I was an angel, I knew I had this concept, and then I'm remembering it when I see the horses. The horse that I see in the world actually remind me of the form of horse that has is in my mind from when I was an angel. He doesn't use the word angel, but you get the idea. Uh-huh.
Is that Platonic form the idea? Is that the isness of horseness? Is like the essence of horse?
Exactly, right. So also horseness. For him, horseness is something that actually exists in the heaven forms. There is one form of horse. And then of course Aristotle's going to say, yeah, but how is that supposed to be? Like if it's an immaterial horse, then how can it have features like being four-legged, like having a mane, having two eyes, having a nose? So that's how Aristotle is going to disagree with this. But that's what he's saying. And then participation, these arrows going down to horses, they all participate. And then when they stop existing, right, the form of horse still keeps existing. Okay, so, yeah. All right, so for next time, we won't read too much in class, but the Republic, right, the horizontal handout has the selection from the Republic. It's only about 6 pages, maybe 10 pages, and then the selection from the Symposium, which is also on the horizontal handout. So we won't read too much of them in class. So we'll just go through the definitions first. I'll talk you through it, and then we can read some of them. But really, those two selections, it's only about 20 pages, but that gives you the core of his metaphysics, right? His view of reality, which you're already familiar with thanks to Parmenides, right? Fundamentally, and then his view of epistemology. But it's called reminiscence. The idea that I remember, right, from my previous life. Learning is actually reminiscent. That's one of the kind of Platonic axioms. When I learn what a horse is, I'm actually remembering that from my previous existence. So see, this way, change is kind of like Parmenides, right? Change isn't real. What's real is the spiritual realm. Remember, thought and being are one. You see how he's maintaining all those kind of Parmenidean commitments, right? But then filling it out and making it make a lot more sense because we each have our soul, reincarnation. So it's actually a coherent worldview as opposed to Parmenides, where there's all these problems about what he's actually trying to say. Okay, so we'll do that next time. Father, to the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and will be forever. Amen.